Hey everyone. Welcome to today's presentation from APQC on uncovering supply chain planning talent management gaps. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marisa Brown, Senior Principal Research Lead for Supply Chain Management at APQC. I am joined by Dan Pellathy, Faculty of Practice at the University of Tennessee. Dan works with a lot of corporate partners at Tennessee, particularly in the supply chain planning space. And today we're going to share some results from our joint research. As far as our agenda goes, we're going to start with a quick look at the research underpinning the data and the insights that we're about to share. Then we'll take a quick look at the strategic priority given to supply chain planning talent management and the most critical skills needed for future success. We'll then look at the gap between the important skills and the effectiveness of development for those key skills. We're going to also take a look at the impact of technology, including AI, on supply chain planning and the skills needed. And then we're going to look at how are organizations currently developing talent in this space and the need for the future. We have a few polls for you to answer throughout the webinar, so please stay engaged. And we want to address your questions. So please, all throughout, feel free to use the Q&A feature or even the chat feature to put in your questions for us. So this research project was driven by the fact that we see supply chain planning at a crossroads right now. Planners are increasingly being expected to take a leading role in managing complex cross-functional processes, helping to drive new kinds of automation and building more agile supply chains. And as a result of all that, the competencies that today's planning professionals need are different than what was the case just a few years ago. So Dan and APQC, we did this research in late 2024 to early 2025 to identify these critical skills needed, look at how well organizations are helping employees to develop them, and then look at the current state of investment in planning talent. We had 462 global participants across more than 17 industries and in 3 different regions. We have published a lot of this research already, and we'll provide you some links at the end of our presentation. That said, let's start by taking a look at supply chain planning talent as a strategic priority. So just briefly, so we're all on the same page, when we talk about supply chain planning, we're talking about the complex ballet that has to happen to coordinate all the external partners, suppliers, distributors, manufacturers, retailers, even customers, as well as internal stakeholders, to efficiently and strategically balance supply and demand. This is no small task, but we're seeing a lot of disruptions and changes. Dan, what's the bottom line here?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Marisa, for having me on this webinar, and really just great research out of APQC. I think maybe I'll take a step back before I give the bottom line. Giving some context, coming out of COVID, I think for companies, COVID was a rude awakening in many ways, and especially for companies looking at their planning group to really help them work through the complexities and the disruptions that were coming out of COVID. And they found, many companies that we've worked with found that those planning muscles, those planning disciplines were in need of a reboot. They required additional skills, they required new skills, and they required additional attention. And so many companies have started to focus on planning particularly. They had developed disciplines within procurement, they had developed disciplines within manufacturing or operations, they had developed disciplines within logistics and warehousing distribution, but had not really built out the skill sets needed for planners to coordinate those functional areas and, as you said, coordinate them with external partners in such a way as to balance that supply and demand so that they did not see those big gaps like like what happened in COVID. And so coming out of that period, myself and others at the University of Tennessee had been doing some work, and we're very happy to partner with APQC to continue this work on what are those new skills that supply chain planners need. And I think it's going to be interesting to look at, a lot more of what we're calling deep work skills, a lot more of what we call in this report social skills. Not that the technical skills go away or that they're not important, but that those technical skills are in some sense table stakes, right? They are the base requirement for planners, but what really allows planners to have that significant impact in their organization is going to be some of the deep work and social skills that we're going to look at.
Great point. Great point. And the bottom line that we found today is that
Many
organizations are in
organizations
here.
are, there's still a
Yeah.
gap. Yes, sorry. Yes, I was
Yeah,
going to get to that bottom line. There's still a gap. Mind the gap.
exactly. Exactly. So that brings us to our first poll. So we want to know in your organizations, to what extent does your senior supply chain leadership prioritize talent development for supply chain planning? So we'll go ahead and launch the poll and pick one of the options on your screen. Let us know. Are they your champions? Is it rare and random? How does it look?
And as folks are filling out this poll, I think it's important to say, think about planning in particular, right? I think as we get into the slideshow, we're going to see some interesting results around that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll take just another few moments to record your experience in your own organization with the support you're getting from senior leadership and supply chain for talent development and planning. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll and show the results. So we see 47% said to some extent, 40% to significant extent, and 7% to a very great extent. So that's really interesting because we're going to compare that now to what we found among our research participants. So what we found is that only a minority of organizations, 23%, have the highest two levels of support from senior leadership. So you all on this call are in better shape in some ways than the folks in our research. Anything you want to add on this, Dan?
Yeah, I think those numbers maybe are a kind of self-selection of the group that's on the call, because I think broadly speaking, and from my own experience and what we see in this research, is that for many companies, planning specific talent development is not the norm. For most companies, they have much broader talent development kind of programs, not specific to planning.
Actually, that's a great point. And that brings us to our next point here on the location of talent development programs. So we look to see, is it across the entire enterprise? Is it within supply chain, or is it the level of supply chain planning? And Dan, there's a point right there.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this, I think, at the end, Marisa. I think it's worth reiterating this point more than once, is that a lot of the transformation that's going on in terms of thinking about talent development, especially in the planning space, is how do we bring that talent development down into the planning function specifically, right? Instead of it being housed and driven by corporate level talent development programs that may or may not have planning specific elements. How do we bring that closer to the planning community? How do we engage planning leaders in making decisions and driving forward that talent development program?
Okay. Thank you. So now we'll get to the critical skills that we need for future success. in supply chain planning specifically. And in our research, we put the skills into three broad buckets. And Dan alluded to the deep work skills already. And deep work is a term coined by Cal Newport, but it's the ability to focus without distraction on a cognitively demanding task. And then we also looked at social skills, those which help us collaborate, set strategic direction, and manage change. And then those technical or job specific skills that may be unique to planning or supply chain or business acumen kind of as a whole. So we looked at over 30 different skills across deep social and technical buckets. And here's what we found. So on the right side of your screen, you see that it's a mix of those three skill categories emerging in the top 10. And therefore, we would suggest that they all contribute to shaping the future of supply chain planning talent. Dan, what do you want to say here about these top skills?
Yeah, I think you've hit the point that it's really a mix of these skills that are required for planners moving forward. Um, And I think, a little bit surprising to many enterprises that I've talked with, many leaders that I've talked with, is that the technical skills were expected to dominate here, right? Planning has been thought of historically as a relatively technical field. But really, what gives the boost to those technical skills, what allows those technical skills to really drive performance in your organization, is being able to communicate, is being able to think strategically and critically about the problems that are trying to be solved, right? Whether that be within your commercial team or whether that be managing disruptions more broadly, and especially thinking about how do we use data to drive better decisions. That's going to have a lot to do with your ability to communicate effectively with that data. So there's a lot there.
Absolutely. And we'll delve into these just a little more here on coming slides. So let's start with our deep work bucket. And here we see the top three skills were critical thinking, which was the number one skill overall, complex decision making, and innovation. And in terms of supply chain planning, critical thinking really means being able to analyze all the facts and determine a course of action here. And there's a lot that goes into this particular skill: observation, interpretation, reflection, evaluation, problem solving, decision making, all of that to kind of come together and formulate the plans for sales and production. And what's interesting is these skills are useful and valuable for forward looking plans, but also for the ability to step back and course correct when reality doesn't match the plans, which of course will be the case sometimes. Um, Anything you want to add here, Dan, on deep work?
Yeah, I would just, I would note a couple of things. One is, it's best not to think of these things as wholly separate skill sets, right? Critical thinking, complex decision making, strategic vision, innovations, there's overlap there.
Mm.
I think the broad takeaway here is that supply chain planners are being asked to do more of this kind of deep work. And, just, for planners on the call, think to yourselves how much of the last, oh, I don't know, couple of months have been spent thinking through scenarios, have been spent making changes to different types of production runs or schedules or other kinds of things, and trying to think about, okay, what are the big implications of these changes? What are these scenarios really going to mean for the business, for strategic orientation of the business, for so that the business can achieve its goals.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are definitely living in a period with a lot of opportunities to flex that change muscle.
Yeah, and not simply react, right? So this, I think
Yeah.
the real question, the real kind of takeaway from here as well is supply chain planners are being asked, don't just react, right? We need planners to actually be those folks who step back and think critically about the big picture. And that's not always that's not always the role that planners have been in. I interact with a lot of planners. It's not always comfortable for planners to be the folks who step back and take a big picture view of what's going on. They're oftentimes much more comfortable in that reactive day-to-day kind of mode, but it's very clear out of these surveys that the future of planning is going to be asking planners to think critically about the big picture.
Absolutely. In fact, I heard someone say that right now, with everything that's happening in supply chains, being aggressive in your planning but slow in your reaction is the key to success.
Yeah, I love that.
So then come the social skills. And these are those, again, that help us with collaborating, setting direction, and managing change. And in the top spot, we see communication, oral and written. And I wanted just to say a note about that because sometimes communication implies maybe a one-way or two-way arrow, right? One person giving, one person receiving, or one to many. But really, what we see in planning is its facilitation of multiple stakeholders. So those arrows are going in all directions. So communication skills are something you see on almost every job listing for every job in every role. But here in planning, it takes on a multiple dimensional kind of aspect because you have to be able to present the story using that data that Dan mentioned to convince your stakeholders of the course of action to go forward with. So, anything you want to add here, Dan, on the
Yeah,
social?
no, just great point, Marisa, on the communication piece, right? And again, communication, stakeholder management, change management, those things influencing, those things really do kind of hang together, right? They overlap. Because oftentimes planners are not the decision makers in the process, right? Planners are there to provide alternatives and to hold those alternatives to actually the truth or what is actually physically possible for our supply chains to complete, and what's the reality of what we can conceivably do with our supply chains. And planners have to be able to present that, present alternatives, present trade-offs in a way that is compelling to the stakeholders that are actually going to be making those decisions within the process. So oftentimes planners need to, as you said, coordinate stakeholders around the communication process rather than, simply one directional telling them what's going on. So I think that's all. The only other point that I would emphasize here, that if I were taking the survey, it would be change management as the first one, change management as the second one, and change management as the third one. I mean, just the amount of change that is going on within organizations, within supply chains, and the planning community is really at the forefront of that change. I think anything from technology transformations, all the way through to managing disruptions. Planners are really at the forefront of that change, and planners have to get very comfortable, not just in being in a dynamic environment, but leading in a dynamic environment.
Very good point. And I'm going to go ahead and take a question we got from one of our participants because it fits in right here. And they want to know, how much have job descriptions changed? Are they moving much more towards strategy versus tactical? Dan, would you say on that?
It's a great question, Bob. Really appreciate that question. And I would say that job descriptions, again, I don't have broad-based research like we're presenting here, but just from my engagement with companies, I would say job descriptions are slow to move on capturing these kinds of skill sets. So these are not the types of skill sets that you're going to be seeing on a typical planner job description. And moreover, um, you know, oftentimes companies are somewhat, I don't, let me say, let me put it this way. Planning isn't always kind of forefront, right? So people end up in planning, right? They start in manufacturing, or they start in a different part of the supply chain, and they kind of end up in planning. And so there's maybe a little less thought given to the kind of the career trajectory and the talent pipeline in planning. That's changing, but again, slow. And that also is going to come, starts to get reflected in some of the job descriptions that you see, because they're, folks making those job descriptions are thinking not just for that particular role, but 2 or 3 steps along that career progression. That's changing, but I think slow to change.
Thanks. And we did get a question also from someone asking about collaboration. And my 2 cents on that would be that that underpins all of this. But what would you say specifically about collaboration, Dan?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Marissa. This collaboration underpins all of these, and really, again, it's a kind of this mix of social skills that collaboration is very much a part of.
Absolutely. So then let's look at our third big bucket of technical or job specific skills. And here we see the top three are demand planning and forecasting, data driven decision making, and data analytics. And I mean, this is at the core of supply chain planning. And I see that, it's going well beyond building future projections based on the past. That's no longer the way it works anymore. But it's the need to be able to analyze complex behaviors and then turn that into guidance for specific products or services coming out of the organization. Dan, what would you like to say on these technical skills?
You absolutely nailed it, Marissa. It is about using data as a tool for guiding decisions, better decisions in the supply chain, right? So again, that demand planning and forecasting, companies recognize the need for that forecasting, but are really thinking about, okay, that forecast is really a guidance. It's not about meeting that forecast number. It's about, okay, here's the kind of guidance that we have, and what's the range of potential outcomes around that forecast. And so how do we use data analytics and some of that data-driven decision making to develop a good, robust plan that will help us meet the variation around what we think that forecast is going to be, right? Because we planners are, again, more and more expected to think not about that point, the kind of point forecast, but really about the distribution of outcomes around that point forecast. Is it a what does that distribution of outcomes potentially look like? And that's where the data analytics and data-driven decision making really come into play.
Yeah, we got a comment from Bob who was very surprised to see risk this far down the list.
I
I would
think,
say
oh, go
go ahead,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, I think here, thinking about risk management from a technical skill set perspective, I think that may be reflecting of why risk is kind of further down the line. I think, if we go back to some of those soft skills and critical thinking skills, these are really about change, not just risk specifically, but how do we live in a dynamic environment, right? And so that's I think captures some of that kind of risk planning, is that we're not going to try to think future about a specific risk and then do kind of traditional risk management around, predicting an impact of a specific risk. No, we're going to think more broadly just about how do we operate in a dynamic environment and how do we create more agile systems.
Great point. Thank you. And while we're on this slide, we did get a question from Devraj. In the technical skills, the first four seem to be overlapping. Am I getting this right or are these unique? And can you share some examples to explain these skills?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about that. I think the demand planning and forecasting skill is somewhat unique here, right? So the demand planning and forecasting skills really are going to be around homing honing the planner's ability to do those forecasts well, to understand the incremental value of forecast changes, right? All of those kind of value added pieces of the forecasting process, because forecasts are not going away. And planners need to understand those and be very technically adept at the kind of at the details of those forecasts, right? Now, data-driven decision making, data analytics, and to some extent technological fluency, I do think there's some overlap there. Especially on the data-driven decision making and data analytics, those really go together. How do we, again, present the story? How do we generate the insights? And how do we present the story so that it's going to be driving forward better decisions? And that technological fluency piece is really about how how comfortable are planners with adopting the next generation of technologies to enable data analytics and data-driven decision making, right? So that technological fluency piece is really about the planner's willingness and ability to adopt new technologies, to try them out, to test them, and to gain value out of them.
Thanks, Dan. So we've talked now about the top skills. Now we're going to shift and look at how are organizations doing when it comes to developing those skills and helping the employees in supply chain planning grow in these critical areas. I won't give you the spoiler alert, but it's not a super rosy picture. So mind the gap. That's the bottom line here. We asked organizations in our research to say how effective their own company and their own organization is on a 5-point scale, from not at all effective to extremely effective. And for each of these top 10 skills, there is a sizable gap between the importance of the skill and the effectiveness in development. And so we took the top 2 options for effectiveness, so the very and extremely effective, and we combine those, and that's the percentage for effectiveness versus the importance percentage that you've seen already. And just want to point out that these gaps are quite large on the most important skills, and this disconnect is something that we think there's an urgent need to address. Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Jenny is, chiming in here that it's consistent that with what she's seeing in companies that she's working with. Again, I just want to emphasize, just looking at that critical thinking, that very first one, that 28% is really, it's really the kind of top answers. It's the 4 and 5 answers, right? So there's a whole left tail of folks who are saying we're doing even much worse than that, in terms of the gap. So there's significant gaps here. Again, I think it's reflective to some extent of the structure of the talent development programs, which tend to be at that very high level, corporate level, and don't home in to specific functional areas like supply chain planning. Don't get the contribution from supply chain planning leaders specifically about what they are seeing in their organizations and how they need to develop those skills.
Absolutely. Good point. And we're getting some comments that, yeah, maybe the gap is due to over reliance on technology. And just whatever the system spits out. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about AI and some of the technology impacts on planning. Okay, so let's see. Let's go
I
into
do want to comment on that one suggestion by Bob about over reliance on technology. I think there is something to that. Companies are not going to technology their way out of having to train planners in thinking critically about things. There's no technological fix for that. And so I think there's an insight there, Bob.
We have a question here. Go ahead, Dan. You see it?
Yeah, I love it. Autodidactism. Is that a word? I don't know. But we'll go with it. Being an autodidact. Yes. Again, I think that ties into innovation, change leadership, that technological fluency, that willingness to kind of adopt and test out technologies. I think there's an element of being an autodidact in all of those. So yes, I think that's a great question.
And if I miss any of your questions, we'll try and come back to them before the end of the presentation. So just looking a little bit more into the different gaps in deep work, we see sizable gaps. And one thing I want to point out here is that at the top, for those skills rated most important for the future, the gaps are larger. And as we go down the list, the gaps get smaller and even reverse in some cases. So that's part of where we're recommending that organizations overhaul or revisit where they're putting the focus of their talent development and the efforts that they're putting into it, making sure that they're focusing on those skills that will really carry them forward into the future.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this also reflects a little bit, I'm going to get, a little bit inside baseball here. I think this reflects a little bit of the kind of response bias for folks who take surveys, right? So if the skill set doesn't seem particularly important to you, then yeah, it seems like your company's doing a pretty good job at it, right? So as you go down that list, the skill sets seem kind of a little bit less important to the respondents, and so they perhaps feel that their companies are doing a kind of a better job at it. Right? I would love to see the companies where people are working that are doing a great job teaching their planners a creativity, ambiguity tolerance, or self-awareness, right? I would love to meet those companies and use them as case studies because I've yet to find them, and they may be out there.
Good point. Yeah. And then when we come to social skills, we see again effectiveness is lagging importance, or rather lagging on the development relative to importance. It's a 31-point gap there for communication, and that's something that really can make or break your success in planning. So anything you want to comment here, Dan?
No, I think that the gaps here speak for themselves. Again, I would just emphasize that this is the future, or at least the future that companies are hoping supply chain planners go toward, right? They're going to be expecting their planners to be much more engaged in stakeholder management and communication and being able to, as you said, kind of facilitate a conversation across multiple stakeholders and balance multiple perspectives and offer trade-offs and offer analysis that helps drive forward a decision.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to technical or job specific skills, again, we see the biggest gaps for those most important skills. Anything you want to add on this one, Dan?
No, I think this one's pretty clear cut. The only one that surprised me there was the business acumen piece. Again, I think that business acumen is going to be an absolutely critical skill for supply chain planners. They really have to start to understand the business that they're supporting. They have to be much more aligned and much more attuned to their commercial teams. They have to understand some of the dynamics in terms of geography, in terms of channels, in terms of lines of business, and be able to present plans and be able to present the relevant information in ways that resonate with stakeholders there. So I was a little bit surprised around business acumen, but otherwise, I think this is again just kind of following the pattern.
Absolutely. So you all have been asking about technology. So we did take a look at the impact of technology, and one of the things we looked at was AI, because you can't read anything, go anywhere without hearing about AI nowadays. So we first asked, what degree have they adopted AI within their supply chain planning? And I think, and on the left side of the screen, you see that when you start to get behind the headlines and the hype that's out there, AI is still not yet widely adopted in supply chain planning. Only about a third of organizations are currently implementing, operating, or optimizing their AI, but the majority are engaged in piloting, considering, or evaluating it. So it's not like there's no movement there, but it's just not yet fully developed. But I think it's the results of the AI coming and the AI that is in place that we see the skills on the right side of our screen that is important for supply chain planning. And just one note here that we want to convey is that not everyone on the team needs to be an AI expert. For synergy to occur, you need to have some team members that have complementary skills. So you need some with that data science and analytical bent, but also you need highly capable users who can leverage the output of the AI for strategic thinking and project management. And just a comment that someone said to me last week that I thought fits here is, I don't need to know how an airplane works to book a seat. But you do need somebody, that mechanic, who does know how it works underneath the hood. Dan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is actually a pretty complex slide because there's a lot of different, companies have been, I think, pretty diverse in terms of their approach to AI. There were some companies that moved very quickly and then have had to slow, particularly as they came up against the data management constraints. And there, I would say, right, that the data management requirements to really kind of deeply automate and generate some of those kind of deep changes and deep capabilities through AI or machine learning or other kinds of new technologies. I think those data requirements are real, and companies have started to slow down as they've approached those data requirements. I think there are a lot of companies that are trying to pilot and evaluate different tools, but mainly those tools are at kind of I'm going to call it a kind of a more top level or surface level application, right? So you may use an AI application to help you generate a plan, or help you create a presentation, or help you put data analytics into a way that's visually appealing, those kinds of things. I think there it's going to be absolutely critical that planners be flexible and be forward in terms of being users and being leaders of that change. Again, planning is one of these areas where new technology is really coming out at a rapid pace, and planners just need to get comfortable saying, "Okay, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to see what it can do." And we're going to try to, if that looks appropriate, we're going to go down some road of either piloting or adopting that. And then there are, I think, companies that are still just very much on the fence or kind of behind on AI. And I think those companies they need to just admit to themselves that this has to happen, and that they need to start thinking seriously about an AI strategy, or a kind of a technology strategy here. Um, Overall, I would say that slow to smooth, smooth to fast, right? So you got to go be strategic, be systematic in that approach, and then be very careful about the data. And doing it that way will help to speed then the overall adoption, and then the kind of leveraging that for real impact.
Great points. Great points. We did get a question about the specific AI tools that teams are evaluating. We did not ask that in our research. Nan, is there anything in general that you could say about the tools for planning that leverage AI?
Oh, I mean, there are just a lot of them out there, and a lot of them you really have to get under the hood of the marketing kind of, whatever you want to call that, to really understand what they're talking about when they say AI, right? Basically, everybody has AI on their website and in their marketing literature, but you really have to get under the hood to really understand what it is. In many cases, AI is simply rebranding of old algorithms that have been pretty much in use for a while now. Sometimes it really is innovative. So there's a wide diversity. So my overall comment would be, as companies think about their adoption and piloting these applications, they have to be very clear on what's under the hood and what's actually driving it. Which, by the way, is why those technical skills and analytic skills on the other side of that screen are so important, because you actually need at least a few people who know what the heck is going on, right? So you need some people who actually know this stuff in order to do it well.
Good point. Good point. Okay. So we did take a look at technologies, and where do people see supply chain professionals needing to be adept in the next 2 years. So cloud, machine learning, mobile, those came up at the top of the list. But there, and you can see algorithmic AI versus generative AI, and not a whole lot going on for blockchain. Never really did take off the way some people were initially forecasting for supply chain. But Dan, what would you like to say here about technologies?
Yeah, so I think, one thing just to notice is that many of these technology are things that are already, well understood and widely adopted. The expectation is here that companies want those to become deeper and, to more deeply embed those technologies to really gain additional efficiencies out of them. Again, you're going to see AI and machine learning come up in conversation. Very important to really kind of get into the details of what that means. Um, I Blockchain was always a bit of a bit of a confusing uh, piece of kind of technology to me when people were talking about blockchain being kind of revolutionary for the supply chain as a whole, just because it is extraordinarily complex, right? There's a lot of complexity that goes into blockchain. I think the thing that's going to make AI have better staying power is that in many ways you can be, as you were saying, Marisa, just an informed user much more easily, and so there's that ability to become an informed user relatively quickly, and make gains with various applications. And so I think AI is going to have more staying power. It's not going to fall off like blockchain did.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I did want to just also point out generative AI being a little lower on the list here. I think when ChatGPT and a lot of those came out mainstream for consumers, we kind of started to see what we used to call the Amazon effect happening, right? Like Amazon trained everyone that you could get your orders delivered so quickly that everyone had to start speeding up their order delivery times. And with generative AI, everyone in their personal life learned how to use it, and they suddenly said, "Hey, why can't we use this at work? What is this doing?" But for supply chain, it seems like some of the more of the value can come from not the generative AI necessarily, but we're increasingly seeing agentic AI or the algorithmic AI, whatever you want to call it, but the other kind of AI, and I am not a technical expert here, but I think it's important to make sure that, we don't get caught up in some of the trends that might be not necessarily as value added in this specific function.
Yeah, and I don't want to leave this slide, giving the impression that somehow these tools are not valuable or can't drive value. They absolutely can. They can be transformative. It's really about how organizations approach developing the additional skills needed, as well as the additional processes needed to really bring these on board and change the way they do really kind of change the way they do business, right? So there's one level of technology adoption that really just layers technology onto the same old thing. The real value comes when you change the way you do your work as you adopt these technologies. And that's what's really meant by this idea of technological transformation, right? It transforms the work. It doesn't just bring in something that layers on top of, business as usual.
Absolutely. We're seeing people get better and better at defining their use cases for these different kinds of technologies as well, because that's really important. So it's not that you have a hammer and you're in search of a nail, but really getting clear on where that value can come from.
Yeah. And again, just to reiterate the point that planning is really at the forefront of many of those changes, because many of those AI applications in the supply chain are really focused on planning, gathering data end to end from the supply chain, driving visibility, driving better decision making. Those are really all applications geared for planners.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, so now we're going to shift a little bit to talk about talent development. And that brings us actually to our next poll. So, our question for you is, does your organization have a strategy for your talent pipeline for planning? So, pick the option that best describes your organization. We can go ahead and launch the poll. Do you recruit externally, externally and internally, only internally, or is there really no strategy and people just end up in planning by accident? All right, everyone take a second and put your thoughts here. Dan, anything you want to say about this poll while we have it open?
Well, as we were creating this poll, I suggested the final choice of people end up in planning by accident almost as a joke. But in reality, for many companies, just planning has not been there hasn't been that focus of developing planning as a unique discipline. And so it is, in fact, the case that many people kind of find themselves in planning after having worked through, multiple different supply chain roles. And there's less of a focus on actually developing that as a specific career path with trajectories, with milestones, with, leadership opportunities, all that good stuff.
So we're going to go ahead and close the poll and see what you guys had to say. All right, let's share those results. 63% recruit both externally and internally for all roles in planning. Dan, you look satisfied with
Hey,
that?
I mean, this group is awesome. I wish this group were representative of all the companies that I interact with. I really do. This is a great group.
We see 16% of you recruit internally only and develop your leaders internally. Another 11% recruit externally for planners through leaders. And then there is that 11% where people just accidentally end up in planning. They kind of fall into it. So it's a good mix for most of you, internally and externally recruiting. So now let's take a look here. We'll close that. And when it comes to building a talent development program, what are the components that most organizations have? And we see it's a pretty big mix. Just like the role itself is multifaceted, oftentimes the talent development program appears to be multifaceted. Um, we see performance management, job architecture, career paths, and learning paths as well. One comment I want to make on this is that most of the components on this list have one thing in common, and that is they're designed to benefit both the organization and the employee. So a career path, for example, focuses on job progression and the roles you need over time as you build a career. But a learning path emphasizes attaining specific skills and knowledge through structured learning. And so, again, back to Dan's point earlier, developmental approaches tailored to the specific needs of employees in supply chain planning really can help lead to better performance outcomes. Anything, Dan, you want to add on the components here?
Yeah, I just think, there's a lot of well-developed approaches to talent development. And so, that's been a focus for many companies for a long time. My caveat here is that, probably my guess would be that many of these components are really at kind of a corporate talent development level and are not dialed in specifically to supply chain planners.
Gotcha. And so here we take a look at actually the approaches in use for supply chain planning. So this is kind of interesting. We see stretch assignments as the most common approach. And what's interesting about stretch assignments is those can be great for helping employees develop new skills as long as the employee is supported and not stretched past their breaking point. And then we see a mix of things like job rotations outside of planning, but within supply chain, some outside supply chain entirely, job shadowing, collaboration with different stakeholders in the organization and outside the organization. So we see a mix of these approaches, but one of the biggest questions we wanted to look at is, well, what's most effective? And so that brings us to this next slide. So the top 5 skills are on the right-hand side. And for each of those, we looked at the organizations that reported being most effective in developing those skills and what are the approaches they're using for talent management. And so here we see for something like critical thinking, it's a whole mix. But job rotations help, and to that earlier point about business acumen, part of business acumen is just understanding how the business works. And getting that exposure through these job rotations is very helpful. And you see it's a mix here too of very personal things like formal mentoring, or professional coaching from an external coach, and things that are more collaborative with many others, like the collaboration with universities or being in a community of practice. Dan, what do you want to point out here about the different approaches for talent
I
development?
think overall, these approaches are really strong. And the thing to kind of keep in mind here is that it's all about experience. It's all about experience, experience, experience. If you want to develop a competency, it's much more kind of a better analogy to think about, building muscles, like strength training, rather than reading a book, right? So it's very much about that experiential ability to continue to build that muscle through different activities, different stretch assignments, having a coach, collaborating with other areas of the supply chain, having rotational programs. Experience is the key here.
And one of the other things that we found in this research is we asked participants to rate the effectiveness of their supply chain planning, talent development efforts as a whole. So all of the efforts going on, how effective is your organization? And we had 19 different talent related goals. And what we found is that the one rated the highest in terms of effectiveness was providing employees with time to learn. But the one with the least was transferring knowledge. So, what this suggests is that organizations do see value in giving employees time to learn, experiential, maybe some one on one coaching and mentoring, whatever the case may be, but they're not so successful in having a formal program that captures the full value that planners create. And it's not just knowledge capture, but knowledge transfer. And knowledge sharing and organizational learning like that are critical for adopting new technologies, for example, or more broadly, helping tap collective insights to solve some of the most pressing issues. So it's important that the organizations recognize that just letting an individual grow and develop is great, but then the strength comes when the organization is able to transfer some of that knowledge.
No,
Dan?
you nailed it, Marisa, right? I'm glad to see that organizations are giving employees time to learn. That's a really critical piece to it. Time, hopefully, to also get mentorship and other types of things. But really, if you're going to solve some of those big, hairy problems, it's going to require ability to transfer knowledge, transfer best practices, to adopt practices that are going on in different areas of the supply chain. It's that knowledge transfer piece is a critical piece. It's always been difficult, right? It's a hard thing to do. But if companies could get that scale moving in the right direction, I think there's a lot of benefit there.
Absolutely. So, bottom line, the need is now. Dan, how would you recommend organizations take action?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot out of this report that organizations can take directly to thinking about how they manage their talent in the supply chain planning space, um, both in terms of developing competency matrix, evaluating planners that currently and thinking about gaps in terms of where they need to develop, putting in front of them additional types of experiences to help them grow. I think that the report gives a lot of good information there. One thing that I would just flag is, the talent constraint in the supply chain is big and getting bigger. I mean, there's a clear shortage of talent in the supply chain. There are lots of reports that kind of bear out the big gaps in what's going to be needed to manage the supply chains of tomorrow in terms of talent and what we have available, right? So it's going to be intense competition over what that means is there's going to be intense competition, right? Over making sure that you get that talent, that planning talent, and that when you get it, when you recruit them, you develop them, you give them career progression, you give them leadership opportunities, and you really kind of make the most out of that talent when you have it, because it's just gonna get harder and harder to pull that talent in from, external sources.
Absolutely. The demographics of our workforce will necessitate you trying to be that employer of choice for planners.
Employer of choice. Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely. So we have provided you some links to learn more from this research project, and we have a white paper coming soon. Whoops. That we will send you a link so that you can learn more. Um, we've taken questions all throughout. I do just want to make sure that you all remind yourselves or remember that you will get a link to the slides and recording in a few days. You're welcome to share and let others in your organization know. Also, we have a satisfaction survey. We always appreciate your feedback and input on that. Dan and I are happy to follow up. We put our email and our LinkedIn contacts on here. And please do continue to connect with us through different social media or other methods. Thank you all so much. We appreciate it. Dan, thank you so very much for sharing your insights throughout the course of this research and on today's webinar.
Yeah, Marisa, it was my pleasure. This was a fantastic project. And again, if folks want to reach out on LinkedIn or via email, very happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.